Before the white cassock and the crowds in St. Peter's Square, he was simply Bishop Prevost of Peru. And in that small city called Chiclayo, a decision he made, or failed to make, would one day shake the Vatican. Before we begin, please subscribe, like this video and tell me in the comment where you are watching from. Now, let's begin. The sun was setting over the narrow streets of Chiclayo, casting long shadows across faded adobe walls and crumbling courtyards. Church bells rang from the old cathedral, low, deliberate, as if tolling for something more than just the hour. In the plaza, vendors were packing up their carts, children chasing each other around stone benches, their laughter echoing beneath a sky streaked with orange and ash. A gentle breeze rustled the palms that lined the old seminary grounds, where birds circled above the steeple like guardians of silence. Inside Parroquia San Lorenzo, the pews slowly filled for evening mass. The scent of incense lingered like a memory. Candles flickered against the chipped marble altar. Somewhere in the back, a boy clutched his mother's hand a little too tightly. Near the front, a man sat alone, quiet, dignified, his shoulders squared not with pride, but with weight. He was Robert Francis Prevost, then Bishop of Chiclayo, not yet a cardinal, not yet a pope. He prayed with his eyes open, staring not at the crucifix, but just below it, as though searching for something he couldn't name. In that same church, a few rows back, sat Father Eleuterio Vasquez, known to the faithful simply as Padre Lute. His face was serene, familiar, even comforting. Yet, among some, his presence summoned unease, a subtle, unspoken discomfort passed quietly between parishioners like a cough politely stifled. As the choir began the opening hymn, a young altar server hesitated before stepping into the aisle. He looked over his shoulder, not at the congregation, not at the bishop, but at Vasquez. The priest gave him a small smile and a nod. The hymn rose like smoke. And beneath its beauty, something else, a question no one dared ask aloud. Sometimes holiness and darkness kneel side by side. And sometimes, the silence of a church is not peace, but warning. Outside, a woman hurried her trembling son out of the church doors. "Say nothing," she whispered, and kissed the top of his head. That night would fade from the city's memory, as so many nights had, but the names spoken in whispers would not. The priest, the bishop, the boy, and the secrets buried between them. Years later, long after that bishop had become Pope Leo XIV, those secrets would return, louder, sharper, impossible to ignore. And in their wake, the church would find itself standing not in light, but in judgment. The wind blew softly that night as the last candle was snuffed out in Parroquia San Lorenzo. Outside, the plaza was nearly empty. Only the distant bark of a street dog and the fading toll of bells remained. The mother and her son had already vanished into the alleys, their silhouettes swallowed by the dusk. But the silence they left behind stayed. It settled into the pews, into the stone, into memory. And like most silences in the church, it was not benign. Years passed. The city of Chiclayo continued its quiet rhythm, feast days, baptisms, processions winding through the streets with brass instruments and floral statues of saints. From the outside, nothing seemed wrong. Faith, after all, was built on what could not be seen. But those who paid attention began to notice things. Father Eleuterio Vasquez, Padre Lute, was still a familiar presence at the altar. Still smiled gently during communion. Still placed his hand on children's heads when they came forward for blessings. Still sang hymns in that soft, solemn voice that parishioners said made the words feel closer to heaven. But it was where he went after Mass that began to stir concern. He had begun taking boys, always boys, on weekend spiritual retreats in the mountains. Quiet affairs. Few details. He said they needed space to reflect, away from the distractions of the city. That God spoke clearest in solitude. And at first, the community believed him, trusted him, revered him. But belief has its limits. And trust, once cracked, begins to whisper. It started with murmurs in the pews. Mothers noticing their sons becoming withdrawn after returning from a retreat. One boy waking in the middle of the night, screaming, unable to explain why. Another refusing to attend Mass at all. "He's just tired," a catechist told a parent. The mountain air changes them sometimes. But it wasn't just tiredness. It was terror in disguise. Two mothers, both longtime members of the parish, approached each other one Sunday afternoon beneath the mango trees in the courtyard. Their voices were low, their eyes cautious. "Your son went too, didn't he?" one asked. "Yes. But he won't talk about it." "Mine either." Not a word. He just stares at the floor and bites his nails until they bleed. There, under the shade of the church's walls, they wrote their first letter. Bishop Robert Francis Prevost received the first envelope in mid-June. It was handwritten, signed by both families, and folded with care. Inside were details, just enough to raise alarm. The trips. The behavior. The change in the boys. And above all, the request. "We are not accusing without cause. We ask only that you look. That you listen. Please, Bishop, do not let this be buried." He read the letter alone in his study, the amber evening light casting long lines across the hardwood floor. He read it twice. Then a third time. And then he placed it, carefully, into a drawer. 2 weeks later, a second letter arrived, from another family, this time with more direct language. They named Father Vasquez. They referenced specific incidents. One father, a carpenter, had found torn clothing in his son's satchel and confronted him. The boy wept for hours, begging him not to go to the church. "What happened?" the father had asked. "He said it was part of confession," the boy replied. That letter, too, was placed in the drawer. Prevost prayed that night longer than usual. It would be easy to villainize him. But conscience is rarely clean. Bishop Prevost was not a man without heart. He had baptized children, comforted widows, built clinics and schools. He saw the church not as a fortress of power, but a living body, broken, yes, but sacred. Still, he was not immune to fear. He feared scandal. He feared division. He feared what would happen if he accused a priest without formal proof, if the church lost the trust of a community already teetering. So he delayed. He made a few calls. Quiet ones. Asked vague questions. He visited Father Vasquez once, under the guise of checking in. They spoke of catechism classes, of weather, of local politics. The name of the boy was never mentioned. That night, Prevost stood at his window and watched the courtyard below, watched the children playing by the fountain, watched the doves gathering on the roof tiles, and whispered to himself, "Lord, give me wisdom." But wisdom without action is its own kind of sin. The families waited. Weeks passed. No reply came. When one mother arrived at the chancery to request a meeting, she was told the bishop was traveling. When another tried to speak with the Vicar General, she was asked to submit her concerns through proper channels. The message was clear, their words had reached ears, but not hearts. In the pews, their children sat silently, eyes downcast. In schoolyards, some were mocked for bringing shame. Others simply stopped speaking at all. They were boys, small, sacred lives, who had tried to believe that God lived behind the altar. Now they weren't so sure. In late September, a quiet sister from the parish, Sister Belen, requested a private meeting with a friend of hers, a local journalist named Mariela Sanabria. They met in a cafe just off the Plaza de Armas. It was early morning. The street still smelled of baking bread and wet stone. Sister Belen wore her habit, but no cross. She looked over her shoulder twice before sitting. Then she spoke. "I don't know everything, but I know enough to lose sleep." She shared what she had seen. Late-night visits. Boys returning pale and anxious. A note she once found in the confessional, unsigned, folded beneath a kneeler. "He says I'll go to hell if I tell." Mariela listened. And wrote. She promised not to publish anything yet. Not without evidence. But she began looking. Began listening. And that's how the story, still hidden, still fragile, began to grow legs. A neighbor mentioned that her cousin had once served on a retreat with Vasquez but left early after seeing something that didn't feel right. An old sacristan recalled once overhearing an argument, a boy shouting, "You lied to me," followed by a door slamming shut. A catechist admitted she had once gone to the bishop about Vasquez but was told not to stir division. No one had proof. Just patterns. Just pain. Still, the threads began to connect. One afternoon, Mariela visited the family of the carpenter whose son had first spoken of the abuse. The boy sat quietly on the back steps, whittling wood. She asked if he remembered the retreat. He nodded. She asked if he wanted to talk. He shook his head, then whispered. He said no one would believe me. He said the bishop already knew. Inside the bishop's residence, the silence deepened. By then, whispers had reached the higher clergy in Lima. Still, no official action was taken. No inquiry opened. Father Vasquez continued presiding over Mass, performing sacraments, baptizing children. He smiled as always. Walked calmly through the square. Stopped to bless fruit vendors and shake hands with police officers. But at night, the pews were emptier. More mothers sat in the back, arms crossed, eyes wary. And each time Bishop Prevost mounted the pulpit to speak of mercy, courage, or truth, he could feel their stares pressing into him like thorns. He was not evil. But he was afraid. And fear in the face of truth is often the seed of betrayal. In the Church, silence is not always peace. Sometimes, it's a wound disguised as obedience. And sometimes the ones who say the least are the ones who've already been told, too many times, to stay quiet. One night, just before Advent, a letter was slid under the rectory door. It bore no signature. Only a line of scripture? For there is nothing covered that shall not be revealed, neither hid, that shall not be known. Luke 12 verse 2. It was handwritten. The same handwriting as the first letter, years ago. Bishop Prevost read it. And said nothing. But he did not sleep that night. Outside, the bells rang again, 3 slow chimes that faded into the wind. The name came later. The Lute Case. At first, it was just rumor and grief, stories whispered in courtyards, passed between families who spoke as if the words themselves were dangerous. But over time, those fragments began to take form. Letters became reports. Reports became evidence. And evidence, when ignored long enough, becomes something else entirely. A scandal. A wound. A reckoning deferred. By 2022, the story had a shape. Mariella Sanobria's notes, kept in a leather-bound journal she refused to let leave her side, contained over a dozen first-hand testimonies. Each story different, yet painfully the same: retreats in the highlands, nights of prayer that turned into silence, silence that hardened into shame. None of the boys called it abuse. Not at first. They said things like he was too close, or he prayed with me alone, or he said God wanted me to trust him. But beneath those phrases, the truth was already visible. Sister Belen, the nun who had first come forward, copied what she could from parish records, baptism certificates, travel rosters, expense ledgers. She noted patterns, the same names, the same trips, the same quiet erasures. Entries crossed out. Files missing dates. Report signed but never stamped. By the time she finished, there was no denying it, the church had known. Received but not pursued. When journalists finally obtained the internal diocesan files through a sympathetic clerk, the phrase that appeared most often was haunting in its consistency. Report received. Action deferred. Matter under review. Case noted but not pursued at this time. Dozens of times, in the same steady typewriter font. Each line a bureaucratic burial. Each one, a quiet exoneration disguised as caution. One memo, dated October 2018, stood out. It bore Bishop Robert Francis Prevost's signature. Due to lack of corroborating evidence and for the good of the faithful, the matter shall be handled internally. No further notes. No follow-up inquiry. Only silence, stamped, archived, and filed away. Within the walls of Chiclayo's chancery, Bishop Prevost was respected, even admired. He was seen as a steady hand, a man of intellect, restraint, and pastoral calm. The Vatican valued his discretion. Priests under his care called him a man who does not make waves. When the allegations against Father Vasquez first arose, Prevost's response was measured, procedural. He promised to pray. He promised to look into it. He spoke of prudence, of avoiding the scandal that might harm the faithful. But scandal, by nature, does not vanish when ignored. It waits. And while the bishop waited, Father Vasquez continued his ministry, unpunished, unmonitored, and undeterred. He still heard confessions. Still baptized infants. Still offered communion to families whose sons had stopped coming to church. On feast days, he was seen leading processions through the city streets, incense rising before him like a false halo. For years, that was enough. Enough to keep suspicion quiet. Enough to make faith and fear indistinguishable. The victims grew into men, but never out of silence. One became a teacher, known for his patience with restless children. Another left Chiclayo altogether, settling near Trujillo, where no one knew his past. One turned to the seminary, saying he wanted to find a version of God that didn't hurt. They lived, but not whole. They prayed, but not freely. Each carried the echo of that same line whispered long ago. If you speak, no one will believe you. And for a time, that was true. When Mariella's article finally ran, a brief expose titled "The Boys from San Lorenzo," it was met not with outrage, but with polite disbelief. Local Catholic radio hosts called it anti-clerical sensationalism. The diocese issued a statement expressing sadness over misunderstandings that malign the Church's mission. Father Vasquez was temporarily reassigned to a parish in the mountains. And the bishop, Robert Francis Prevost, said nothing. Within weeks, the story faded. But the name stuck. The Lute Case. In 2023, a confidential review was prepared for the Peruvian Episcopal Conference. It contained 23 pages. 23 quiet admissions that should have changed everything. The report confirmed that early allegations against Father Vasquez were indeed received in 2018 and 2020, but not escalated to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the Vatican body responsible for such cases. The reasoning? To preserve the integrity of the diocese and protect the faithful from scandal. Protect the faithful. The faithful, not the children. The language of holiness had become the language of harm. One page summarized it bluntly. Due to the bishop's pastoral prudence, certain matters were resolved without recourse to penal process. Translated plainly, nothing was done. The Church's archives rarely record emotion. But sometimes, between the lines, humanity bleeds through. On one page, a handwritten note from an unnamed priest. I fear our silence will one day be the greater sin. Another file contained an attachment, a photocopy of a boy's letter to the bishop, written in blue ink, shaky handwriting. I don't want him to come to my school. Please tell him not to find me. The letter was never answered. It sat in the folder like a relic of a faith that no longer recognized its own reflection. When news of the Lute case reached Rome, it was not through official channels, but through journalists and advocacy groups. By then, Robert Francis Prevost had risen, first to cardinal, then to a powerful Vatican post. In 2024, he became Pope Leo XIV. To many, he represented reform, a scholar pope, a man of intellect and mercy. His election was hailed as a return to humility after years of ecclesial division. But for those who remembered Chiclayo, the past did not vanish with a new name. Reporters traced the old case back to him. They sought comment. And when asked, Pope Leo XIV, then still Cardinal Prevost, gave a short, carefully worded response. It was a complex matter. We acted with prudence. The words were measured. Pastoral. But to the victims, they sounded like erasure. Because prudence, as it turned out, had meant silence. Silence meant survival, for the Church, not for the children. Investigators and canon lawyers who later reviewed the diocesan handling of the Lute case noted that it followed a familiar pattern, one seen in dioceses across the world. Initial denial. The Church expresses sadness but not acknowledgement. Internal review. Documents are gathered, not to expose truth, but to contain it. Clerical protection. The accused priest is quietly reassigned for pastoral reasons. Institutional amnesia. Files are sealed. Witnesses are discouraged. The years pass. Each stage justified in the name of faith, faith that somehow forgot that truth itself was sacred. Sister Belen, when later asked by investigators why she had spoken, answered simply. Because someone had to believe the boys. Someone had to remember what mercy was meant to feel like. By the time the case was known publicly, Parroquia San Lorenzo was nearly empty on Sundays. The faithful still came, but hesitantly, crossing themselves not with reverence, but with unease. The confessional booth stood unused. Candles burned shorter. Outside the church, graffiti appeared on the wall one morning. ¿Dónde está la justicia? Where is justice? By evening, it had been painted over. Inside, Father Vasquez's portrait still hung among the parish photographs, smiling beside Bishop Prevost in full vestments, both of them framed by flowers. No one dared remove it. The survivors sometimes walked past, pretending not to look. They had learned that forgetting was easier than fighting ghosts. But the ghosts remained. In interviews years later, theologians debated the meaning of the word prudence, the very word the bishop had used to defend his inaction. One called it the most dangerous virtue. Another described it as a shield used to hide the lack of courage. To those who lived it, prudence had not felt like virtue at all. It had felt like being erased by grace itself. The Church's official narrative, written years after the events, concluded that no conclusive evidence of grave misconduct had been found during Bishop Prevost's tenure in Chiclayo. But the absence of evidence was not innocence. It was the proof of how thoroughly the evidence had been buried. Among the archives later uncovered by journalists was one final entry, a short typed note dated March 2024, unsigned but bearing the diocesan seal. This file to remain sealed until otherwise directed by the Apostolic See. Below it, handwritten in faint pencil. Handled internally. It was the last recorded reference to the Lute Case in official church documents. After that, the file disappears. Its location remains unknown. Years later, in Chiclayo, parishioners still remembered the old bishop fondly. They said he was kind, that he helped the poor, that he had once donated money to rebuild a flood-damaged chapel. Few mentioned the case. Fewer still dared to connect the new Pope Leo XIV to the priest they once knew. Faith, after all, survives best when it forgets. But among those who could not forget were the victims, now men, middle-aged, with children of their own. Some still attended Mass, quietly, in other parishes. One of them, now a father himself, told a reporter, "I still believe in God. Just not in men who claim to speak for him." In Rome, years later, Pope Leo XIV's photograph would hang in St. Peter's Square, white cassock, serene smile, the words "Renewing the Church in Truth and Charity" printed beneath. In Chiclayo, a small group of survivors gathered outside the same church where it all began. They lit candles. None of them spoke. They didn't need to. Inside, the bells rang again, not for celebration, not for mourning, but for memory. The sound carried through the empty streets, through the same cracked walls that had once hidden their cries. "Justice delayed is faith betrayed." The words appeared later on a placard outside the church, placed there anonymously. No one claimed to know who wrote it. But everyone understood who it was for. The bells of San Lorenzo no longer rang with conviction. They echoed now like questions. Long after the Lute Case had faded from headlines, long after bishops issued statements and silence fell like dust on old pews, the victims remained, waiting, grieving, praying that someone, somewhere, still cared. In the spring of 2024, someone finally did. Father Ricardo Coronado Arascu was not a man of rank or power. He did not sit on commissions. He was not often photographed. In the crowded corridors of church politics, he was barely a shadow, a canon lawyer known mostly for his quiet insistence on justice, even when justice was inconvenient. He lived alone in a modest parish house on the outskirts of Lima. A narrow, two-story structure where cracked tiles curled up from the roof and vines crept through the garden wall. He had turned the upstairs into a study, not much more than a desk, a crucifix, and shelves lined with canon law commentaries, all worn at the spine. At night, he studied under a single lamp. He kept a rosary beside his books, not as ornament, but as shield. Every evening, before turning to the ancient codes and decrees, he would sit in silence and whisper the same prayer. Señor, si me haces tu voz, que no tiemble la mi. Lord, if you make me your voice, let mine not tremble. He had no ambition for headlines. No appetite for scandal. Only a growing ache that somewhere the gospel had gone missing beneath robes and protocol. It came on a Tuesday morning in May 2024, a knock at the parish door, followed by a soft, trembling voice. "We were told you help people the church won't hear," the woman said. She held her son's hand, not a child anymore, but a young man with eyes that looked 20 years older than his face. They were one of the families from Chiclayo. Victims of the Lute Case. People whose letters had been left unopened. Whose stories had been treated as inconvenience. Father Coronado listened. He asked no questions at first. Only offered tea. Only nodded when the boy finally spoke, slowly, haltingly, describing what had happened to him. When they finished, Coronado folded his hands. "If you still want the church to hear you," he said, "then I will speak." Word spread quickly among the other victims. Within 2 weeks, 5 families had reached out. Some came in person, others through letters delivered quietly by friends. Each story added a new layer, not just of pain, but of proof. Coronado gathered their testimonies carefully. He didn't rush them. He didn't turn them into exhibits. He listened. He wept with them. He asked what they wanted from the church, not vengeance, but truth. One father, a former altar boy himself, said, "I want to believe again. But I can't until the church stops pretending." That night, Coronado returned to his desk. He opened a blank document and began drafting what would become one of the most important canonical petitions in recent Peruvian church history. The formal request was addressed to the Peruvian Episcopal Conference, CEP. Its language was precise, humble, but unyielding. In accordance with Book 7, Canon 1400, and the sacred duty to seek justice within the body of Christ, I respectfully request access to all sealed documentation pertaining to the allegations known collectively as the Lute Case, involving Father Eleuterio Vasquez of the Diocese of Chiclayo. It was not a media stunt. It was not leaked to reporters. It was canon law doing what it was meant to do, protect the little ones, not just the hierarchy. At the top of the final page, in bold italics, Coronado wrote, "For there is nothing hidden that will not be made manifest, nor anything secret that will not be known and come to light." Luke 8 verse 17. He signed it simply. Reverend Ricardo Coronado Arascu, canon lawyer in good standing. Then he placed the letter in an envelope, sealed it with wax, and carried it himself to the CEP central office in Lima. For the first time in years, the victims felt seen. They didn't expect miracles. But they had someone in their corner, a priest, not for the institution, but for them. Coronado held small prayer gatherings for the families. He asked each survivor to write a statement, not for legal use, but as testimony, a way to reclaim their voice. He read the statements aloud, in the chapel, one by one, placing them before the tabernacle. Even if the church will not listen, he told them, God will. A young man, one of the earliest known victims, brought a photo of his first communion. He placed it at the foot of the altar and said, This was the last time I believed the church would protect me. I want it back. For a time, it felt like maybe they could get there. That maybe the church had one last breath of courage left in it. But courage, like truth, has enemies. Coronado's letter, once received by the Episcopal Conference, triggered a quiet storm behind closed doors. Bishops met in side rooms. Whispered questions spread through chancery halls. Why now? What does he hope to gain? Does he understand the damage this could do? He received no official response. But subtle signs began to appear. A longtime colleague in the tribunal stopped answering his calls. A scheduled lecture on canonical reform at a local seminary was quietly cancelled. He received a message from a senior bishop advising him to proceed with caution for the good of the church. Coronado replied, "Truth is never harmful to the church. Only the refusal to face it is." By July, Father Ricardo had become a quiet symbol. Families began referring to him as El Defensor, the defender. But he rejected any title. He continued his routines: Mass at dawn, visits to the sick, confessions in the afternoons. At night, he worked late, surrounded by documents, testimonies, legal codes, and scripture. He slept little. Ate simply. Once, a friend asked him why he hadn't hired someone else to help him, a lawyer, a journalist, even another priest. He smiled and said, "Because if I don't carry this, I cannot ask anyone else to." His cassock was clean, but worn at the sleeves. The silver crucifix around his neck had belonged to his grandfather, a priest during Peru's dictatorship, a man who once risked his life to protect political prisoners in the church basement. Faith, in Ricardo's family, was not measured by mass attendance. It was measured by how much pain you were willing to bear for the truth. On July 11th, he made one final attempt to reach the Episcopal Conference. He sent a second letter, this one more urgent in tone, referencing Canon 1717, which mandates that when an accusation is received, a preliminary investigation must be initiated. Still, no response. The silence was now unmistakable, not an oversight, but a strategy. Something was happening. He could feel it, not in his phone or inbox, but in the cold glances of chancery officials, in the way priests he once mentored now crossed the street to avoid conversation. But he was not afraid. On the feast of St. Thomas More, patron of lawyers and martyrs, Coronado celebrated Mass alone in his chapel. He prayed aloud. "Lord, if I must walk into darkness, let my hand still carry light." He placed a small icon of Saint Oscar Romero near his desk, the bishop who had died with the Eucharist in his hands after speaking out for the poor. That night, he began preparing a final dossier to send to Rome. He didn't know that forces were already moving to stop him. In a private room at the CEP headquarters, a confidential meeting was held just days after Coronado's second letter arrived. No minutes were taken. No recordings were permitted. But those who were present described the tone as one of alarm. "We cannot allow this case to destabilize the faithful," one bishop reportedly said. "We must protect the unity of the Church. Not the truth. Not the victims. The unity." And unity, in their eyes, meant silencing the man who dared reopen the wound. By the end of that meeting, a decision had been made. The wheels were in motion. It was a quiet July night when Father Ricardo received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single slip of paper. "There are things you should not touch, Father. Be wise." He folded it carefully, set it beside his Bible, and returned to his writing. Outside, the bells rang once, just one lonely chime in the dark. He looked up toward the crucifix on the wall and whispered, "Even if they silence me, the blood still speaks." And somewhere, deep in the Vatican archives, the sealed files of the Lute Case remained untouched, for now. But the locks were trembling. By mid-July of 2024, the air in Lima felt charged, heavy with the kind of silence that comes before a storm. The city's churches glowed under winter sun, gold and stone and shadow. From the outside, the church looked unshaken. Inside, it was trembling. Father Ricardo Coronado Arascu had done what few dared. He had challenged not a priest, but the system that protected him. His request for access to the Lute Case files had arrived at the Peruvian Episcopal Conference, CEP, the nation's highest ecclesiastical authority, and was now sitting on a mahogany table surrounded by men who wore crosses of gold and faces of caution. Behind closed doors, the bishops gathered. Curtains drawn. Recorders off. Their voices hushed but sharp, like blades wrapped in linen. The agenda on paper read, "Pastoral response to emerging challenges in church governance." But everyone knew what it really meant: Coronado. Bishop Alvarez, known for his stern conservatism, spoke first. "He's stirring unrest. This letter has already circulated among lower clergy. If we allow him access, the press will follow. It could damage the church's credibility." Archbishop Rios leaned back, steepling his fingers. "It's not just about the files. It's about setting a precedent. If one priest can demand to see sealed documents, others will follow." A younger bishop, one of the few who still spoke with conviction, tried to object. But his asking within canonical rights. The victims, interrupted Rios, have been tended to pastorally. The matter is closed. No one mentioned the Lute Case by name. It was referred to only as the situation in Chiclayo. No one said abuse. No one said Vasquez. They spoke instead of a unity, prudence, the good of the faithful. Words that once carried meaning, now hollowed into excuses. And when the meeting ended, the decision was made, not about justice, but about control. "Father Coronado," said Bishop Alvarez, "must be contained." In the following weeks, a team of canonists loyal to the conference began drafting a statement. It would appear official, procedural, unassailable. In truth, it was none of those things. The document accused Father Coronado of canonical imprudence and acting beyond the scope of his authorization as a church lawyer. It cited no law. It offered no evidence. Yet it carried the seal of the Peruvian Episcopal Conference. Dated August 24, 2024, it read, "It has been determined that Father Ricardo Coronado Arascu is not authorized to act as an ecclesiastical lawyer or to represent individuals in canonical matters, given recent conduct that has caused confusion among the faithful." It concluded with a chilling phrase, deliberate and vague. "For the good of the Church." There was no signature from the Pope. No decree from Rome. Just a committee's decision, and the heavy silence that followed it. At dawn the next morning, Catholic news sites across Peru began to circulate the headline, "Canon lawyer disqualified by Episcopal Conference." By midday, it was everywhere. Some framed it as a disciplinary measure, others as a political scandal. One outlet called it an unprecedented act of censorship within the Peruvian Church. Priests texted each other in disbelief. Journalists called the chancery for comment. The CP offered a single-line statement to the press. The Church has acted with prudence in a matter that required discretion. That word again, prudence. The same word used to bury the Lute Case. The same word that meant, in truth, silence. In Chiclayo, the victims' families gathered in a small courtyard behind San Lorenzo. The same place where their first letters had been written years before. They sat in stunned quiet. One mother clutched a newspaper so tightly the ink rubbed off on her hands. "So they silence him too," she whispered. "Just like they silenced us." Another wept, not out of surprise, but exhaustion. "We knew this would happen," she said. "The Church protects itself, not its children." But not all were defeated. The father of one survivor raised his voice. "Then we will pray louder. If they close the doors, God will open windows." In Lima, young seminarians who had admired Coronado began whispering among themselves. Some questioned their vocation. Others sent him letters of solidarity, unsigned to avoid retribution. One note read, "You taught us that faith without courage is only fear pretending to be holy." Father Ricardo read the statement alone in his study. He had known opposition would come, but not like this, not with such speed, such precision, such cruel efficiency. He laid the document flat on his desk and stared at the words "not authorized to act." For years, the Church had taught him that authority flowed from truth. Now, it was truth itself that had been disqualified. He turned off the lamp and sat in the dark. Outside, traffic hummed distantly through the Lima streets. Somewhere, a church bell rang, its echo faint but insistent. He whispered to the crucifix on his wall, "They say I can no longer speak for them, Lord. But can I still speak for you?" Within the clergy, the response was immediate and divided. Some priests defended the decision, calling it necessary discipline. Others were outraged. Quietly, privately, they circulated canon law commentaries showing that only the Vatican had authority to revoke a priest's status as a canon lawyer. "This is irregular," said one veteran canonist in Cusco. "This has no legal basis," another confirmed. "It's punishment disguised as procedure," a third concluded. But none of them would say so publicly. Because in the Church, truth may be divine, but obedience is survival. Behind the scenes, the CEP's communication office coordinated a response strategy. Press releases. Talking points. Strategic interviews with sympathetic media. The narrative was simple: Father Coronado had acted out of turn. He had confused the faithful. He had misinterpreted his role. He had caused division in the body of Christ. No mention of the victims. No mention of the Lute Case. Only the image of a church protecting itself from its own conscience. One internal memo, leaked weeks later, summarized the goal bluntly. Frame this as a matter of order, not of truth. Within days, Coronado's email inbox was flooded. Some messages offered support. Others, thinly veiled threats. "You should remember your vow of obedience. The Church does not need heroes. You're endangering souls." He ignored most of them. But one message, unsigned and sent from a diocesan address, chilled him. "If you continue, you will lose everything: your title, your ministry, your priesthood. Let this go." He closed the laptop and breathed deeply. It was not anger he felt, it was grief. Grief for what the Church had become. Grief for what it had forgotten. He took his worn rosary in hand, thumb tracing each bead like a pulse. "Forgive them," he murmured. "They don't even hear themselves anymore." By the end of August, the strike against truth, as one journalist later called it, had ignited public debate across Catholic media. Opinion columns divided the faithful. Some accused the bishops of authoritarian overreach. Others accused Coronado of betrayal. Television talk shows hosted heated discussions. Padre Coronado trended on Peruvian social media, an unprecedented sight for a church story. International outlets picked it up. Headlines in Spanish, Italian, and English echoed across timelines. Peru's bishop sanctioned priest who defended abuse victims. Silencing the canon lawyer. A church that punishes conscience. The Vatican press office remained silent. But whispers spread that certain officials in Rome were watching carefully. In an institution built on confession, the greatest sin was truth itself. Not the act of hiding it, but the fear of facing what it might reveal. And those who dared to open the door were not hailed as prophets, they were treated as traitors. On the evening of August 31, 2024, Father Ricardo returned to his parish after a long day of interviews and unanswered calls. The corridors felt quieter than usual. Even the parish cat, who often greeted him at the gate, was nowhere to be seen. He entered the chapel, small and unadorned, just a wooden altar, a few pews, a crucifix worn smooth from years of touch. He lit a single candle and knelt before the tabernacle. The flicker of the flame cast trembling shadows across his face. He removed the document, the statement of his disqualification, from his pocket and placed it on the altar. "If I must be silenced," he whispered, "let heaven speak for me." He bowed his head, and for a long moment, there was only stillness. Outside, the wind pressed against the chapel doors, rattling them like a heartbeat. Somewhere in the city, a bell rang 3 times, slow, solemn, final. And though the church above him tried to bury the truth, something sacred was already stirring beneath the weight of stone. At first, the silence felt like mercy. After the public rebuke, no new statement came from the bishops, no letters, no calls. For a brief moment, Father Ricardo Coronado believed the storm might be passing, that, perhaps, time and prayer would calm the fury stirred by his pursuit of truth. But silence, he was learning, could also be a trap. Because in the shadows where institutions defend themselves, silence is never empty. It's the sound of knives being sharpened. By mid-September 2024, the first rumors began to appear online. Anonymous posts on Catholic forums and social media accounts whispered of imprudence and unbecoming behavior. At first, the allegations were vague, insinuations of moral irregularities and questionable associations. A few even claimed he had acted in ways unbecoming of a priest. No evidence. No source. Only suggestion. But suggestion, once planted, grows quickly. Within days, Catholic blogs picked up the thread. One headline read, "Controversial canon lawyer's past raises questions." Another said, "Father Coronado's motives, hero or hypocrite." Each line blurred the truth a little more, mixing facts with poison. The story spread not like fire, too bright, too visible, but like rot, slow and unseen, eating at reputation until nothing solid remained. A week later, a Spanish-language site claimed to have sources close to the Episcopal Conference who alleged that Coronado had violated internal confidentiality and acted against ecclesial unity. An unsigned email circulated among parishes warning clergy to distance themselves from the priest in question until the Holy See clarifies his canonical status. Even priests who had once admired him began to step back, not out of betrayal, but fear. One wrote privately, "Padre, I believe you. But they're watching. I can't risk my parish." Rumors multiplied, each contradicting the last, a sure sign of design. Some said he had been seen in places inappropriate for clergy. Others hinted he had ties to secular organizations hostile to the Church. A few even claimed he had mental instability. None of it was true. But in the age of whisper and click, truth moves slower than lies. By October, his inbox was flooded again, this time not with support, but with suspicion. Strangers demanded explanations. Former colleagues avoided him. Reporters who once quoted him now hesitated to include his name. Even within the victim's circle, confusion spread. One mother asked quietly, "Padre, they say things, are they true?" He looked at her, eyes tired, voice steady. "If they cannot refute my words, they must attack my name." But her hesitation hurt him more than any headline. Faith, he realized, can endure persecution, but not abandonment. And for the victims, those who had dared to trust him, it felt like the earth shifting beneath their feet. For the families of Chiclayo, the smear campaign was déjà vu. They had seen this before, the same tactics used years ago when they first spoke of Padre Lute. Then, as now, the Church had defended the institution by sacrificing the truth. One survivor said bitterly to a journalist, "First they protected the abuser. Now they destroy the defender. The method hasn't changed, only the target." Faith began to fracture. Some of the victims stopped attending Mass altogether. Others prayed alone in their homes. A mother who once kept a photo of Father Ricardo near her altar quietly turned it face down, not out of shame, but sorrow. The stress began to show. Father Coronado had never been a robust man, too many sleepless nights, too many years of quiet burden. But now his health faltered visibly. He developed a persistent cough. His hands trembled when he lifted the chalice at morning Mass. Parishioners noticed the pallor in his face, the dark crescents under his eyes. Friends urged him to rest, to step away, to leave Peru for a time. One even arranged a safe place for him in Spain, away from the glare and gossip. He refused. "If I leave," he said, "they win twice, first by silencing the truth, then by erasing the one who spoke it." He continued celebrating Mass daily, even when his voice broke mid-homily. He still visited the sick, still heard confessions, though fewer came. He still wrote letters, one each week, to the victims' families, encouraging them not to lose hope. But at night, alone in his study, he would pause over the open Bible, his fingers resting on the verse he had once quoted to the bishops. "For nothing is hidden that will not be made manifest." And sometimes, he wept, not for himself, but for the Church he still loved. Amid the storm, one journalist, Mariela Sanabria, the same reporter who had first uncovered the Lute Case, refused to stay silent. She met Coronado in early November, in the same small cafe where, years before, Sister Belen had confided her fears. He arrived late, moving slowly, his cassock slightly frayed. The cafe was nearly empty, the morning light filtering through dusty windows. Mariela set down her recorder. "Padre," she said gently, "they're calling you everything but faithful." He smiled faintly. "The Church I love," he said, "has turned against me. But I still serve her truth." His voice cracked slightly at the word love. "Truth," he added, "is not rebellion. It's confession, and I am still confessing." Mariella watched him closely, realizing she was witnessing something rare, not defiance, but devotion. The kind that bleeds quietly, without spectacle. She published their conversation weeks later under the headline, "A Priest Betrayed by His Own Church." The story spread across Latin America. Some readers called him a saint. Others a heretic. But for the first time in months, his own words were louder than the lies. The campaign against him showed no sign of stopping. By December, a new set of rumors surfaced, claims that he had been formally suspended, though no decree existed. Parish bulletins avoided mentioning his name. It was then that Father Ricardo decided to act once more. He began drafting a final letter, his appeal to the Holy See. It was written not in anger, but in sorrow and faith. 10 pages long, typed on an old machine that sometimes skipped letters. He addressed it to the dicastery for the clergy, but his words were for the heart of the Church itself. To whom it may concern in the Apostolic See. I write not to defend myself, but to defend what remains of conscience within our Church. I have been accused without process, judged without cause, and silenced without reason. Yet my silence would wound the body of Christ more deeply than their lies. I have represented those whom the Church forgot, not against her, but for her, believing that the truth she fears is the truth that will one day heal her. If I am wrong, let Rome tell me so. But if I am right, let her remember that the shepherd's first duty is not to protect the fence, but the sheep. For nothing is hidden that will not be made manifest. Fr. Ricardo Coronado Arascu. Lima, Peru, December 22, 2024. He printed 2 copies. One was sent through diplomatic mail to the Apostolic Nunciature. The other he folded neatly and placed inside his Bible, between the pages of Luke. Then he knelt to pray. The weeks that followed were eerily still. No reply came from Rome. No statement, no summons, no word. But the rumors continued, louder now, emboldened by the Church's quiet consent. Parishioners spoke of seeing him cough blood after Mass. Others said he spent nights praying in the chapel until dawn, refusing to sleep. They were right. Each night, he lit a single candle before the crucifix and whispered the same plea. "Let the truth outlive me." His faith, though battered, burned and dimmed, a fragile flame against a wall of marble. In every age, the Church produces martyrs. Some die in prisons, others in silence. But all of them are killed by the same hand, the one that mistakes obedience for holiness. And when the Church turns against her own prophets, heaven keeps the record. On Christmas Eve, Father Ricardo celebrated midnight Mass in the nearly empty chapel. Only a handful of parishioners attended. The candlelight trembled on the faces of the few who still believed. He preached softly, his voice hoarse, his hands trembling as he lifted the chalice. "God is born tonight," he said, "not in a palace, but in a stable, outside the walls of power. Remember that when they tell you he prefers silence." When the Mass ended, the last worshipper lingered to kiss his hand. He smiled, exhausted but peaceful. Later that night, he returned to his study and wrote a single line in his journal. "If I must fall for telling the truth, may I fall toward the light." He placed his pen beside the candle and closed his eyes. Outside, the wind carried the faint echo of church bells, distant, mournful, resolute. The smear campaign had destroyed his name. But not his witness. And somewhere in Rome, sealed beneath marble and silence, his letter waited, a prayer disguised as an appeal. The envelope arrived on a Monday morning, December 16, 2024. It bore the Vatican seal, the crossed keys of Peter pressed in crimson wax, the papal insignia glimmering faintly under the pale Lima light. Father Ricardo Coronado stared at it for a long while before touching it. He had been waiting for an answer from Rome, some sign that his appeal, his letter, his faith, had not vanished into marble corridors. Now it seemed Rome had answered. Only, the weight in his chest told him otherwise. The letter was brief, 2 pages, written in the Vatican's formal Latin and accompanied by a short translation in Italian. In view of recent conduct deemed gravely inconsistent with the obligations of clerical life, and after careful consideration by competent ecclesiastical authorities, the Holy Father decrees that Father Ricardo Coronado Arascu is hereby dismissed from the clerical state. It was signed by mandate of His Holiness, plus Cardinal G. Caprini, Secretary for the Clergy. Stamped. Sealed. Final. But when Coronado read it again, his eyes caught on a small but crucial detail, something absent. There was no papal signature. No date beneath the Pope's name. No protocol number from the Apostolic See. Just a seal and a statement. He lifted the paper to the light, studied the watermark, the ink, the seal's indentation. Something felt wrong. The Vatican seal was genuine, but faintly blurred, as if pressed second-hand. He whispered to himself. No signature, no rescript, then who wrote this? Within hours, Coronado reached out to 2 canon lawyers he trusted, one in Cusco, another in Rome. He sent them copies of the decree, scanning every page meticulously. By evening, the replies began to arrive. Father, the document has irregularities. This decree lacks canonical form. Without the Pope's signature, it cannot be authentic. One lawyer was more blunt. This is not Rome. This is someone pretending to be Rome. Coronado sat at his desk, the decree lying open before him like a wound. He realized, slowly and coldly, that the campaign against him had taken its final form. Silencing him was not enough. Now they would erase him entirely. When Mariella Sanabria arrived at his parish 2 days later, she found him pale but composed, sitting beneath a crucifix with the decree laid carefully on the table. "Is it true?" she asked. He nodded. "But it's a forgery," he added quietly. "They've made the Vatican their accomplice." She examined the letter, the seal, the phrasing, the missing papal signature. Her eyes widened. "If this is false, Father, it's not just a smear. It's a crime." Coronado nodded again, his voice steady. "Then perhaps they've gone too far." She took photos, careful and methodical. She would have them analyzed by forensic experts. But already she could see the truth. The decree's tone was bureaucratic, not papal, the language of administrators, not shepherds. By December 20th, the story had leaked. A small Catholic news blog in Spain published a headline that rippled through the church world. Vatican decree against Peruvian priest raises questions of authenticity. The article included images of the decree, with the signature line conspicuously blank. Within hours, major outlets picked it up. Italian journalists reached out to the Vatican press office for comment. No response came. But by the next morning, whispers spread through the corridors of the Holy See. There was no decree. The Pope never signed it. Someone is forging Vatican documents. The name Coronado began to circulate among cardinals, not as a troublemaker, but as a symptom of something darker, a bureaucracy so bloated and divided that deceit could slip through it unnoticed. In Rome, a senior official within the dicastery for the clergy quietly confirmed to journalists that no papal rescript removing Father Coronado had ever been issued. He spoke under condition of anonymity. "We have no record of such a decree. No authorization. No protocol number. If it exists, it was not signed by the Holy Father." The implication was devastating. Somewhere within the Church's diplomatic network, between Lima and Rome, someone had manufactured a lie, wrapped it in ceremony, and sent it out with the Pope's seal. An official forgery. Mariella began tracing the paper trail. She interviewed contacts in Lima's nunciature, the Vatican's embassy, where she discovered something extraordinary. The letter had not come through the usual courier or nunciature channels. It had been hand-delivered by a man claiming to represent the apostolic nunciature, using credentials later discovered to be counterfeit. The courier disappeared 2 days later. Further inquiries revealed a pattern. Similar forgeries had surfaced in previous years, minor decrees, subtle edits, all funneling through a small network of church bureaucrats and consultants who handled unofficial communications between dioceses and Rome. A system built on trust had become a marketplace of deception. They used the machinery of faith, Mariella wrote in her notes, to manufacture lies that looked like truth. On December 22, the story reached international outlets. Headlines appeared across Europe and Latin America. Forgery scandal rocks the Vatican. Fake papal decree used to silence Peruvian priest. Who signed for the Pope? The Vatican press office could no longer remain silent. A statement was issued, cautious, bureaucratic, and clearly drafted by committee. "We are aware of reports concerning an alleged decree involving Father Ricardo Coronado Arascu. The Holy See confirms that no such document was signed or authorized by His Holiness. Investigations are ongoing." It was the closest thing to vindication Coronado had ever received. Yet it came without apology. Without acknowledgement of the deeper rot. In Peru, disbelief turned to outrage. Catholic media split into factions. Some blamed the bishops for orchestrating the forgery. Others accused rogue officials of exploiting a confused Vatican bureaucracy. In Chiclayo, survivors of the Lute Case held a small vigil outside San Lorenzo, holding candles and copies of the forged decree. A hand-painted banner read, "If Rome will not speak, we will." The image went viral, rows of candles flickering beneath the night sky, the faces of survivors illuminated by the light the Church had tried so hard to extinguish. Whispers inside the Vatican grew louder. Certain curial officials hinted that the forgery had been processed through diplomatic channels, a polite euphemism for corruption. Documents were being facilitated for money, favors, or influence. The Church's administrative veins, designed to carry the lifeblood of authority, had become conduits for deceit. One Vatican insider summarized it grimly. "In this Church, even lies can wear cassocks." Mariella met Coronado again on Christmas Eve, just a week after the forged decree's arrival. He was thinner, paler, but his eyes burned brighter than she had ever seen. She asked him how he felt now that the forgery had been exposed. Relieved, she suggested. He smiled faintly. "No." Saddened. "Because it proves," he said, "that evil doesn't need to destroy the Church. It only needs to imitate her." He leaned forward, his hands trembling slightly on the table. "They used the keys of Peter," he whispered, "to lock out the truth." In early January 2025, as investigations continued, internal Vatican reports confirmed what many already knew, that the decree had originated not from Rome, but from a third-party intermediary within the Peruvian diplomatic circuit. No names were given. No arrests made. The trail ended where all scandals end in the Church, at the edge of accountability. But among those who still believed in truth, the journalists, the survivors, the few brave priests who refused to bend, the meaning was clear. Someone within the Church had weaponized the very symbols of holiness, the seal, the language, the authority of the Pope himself, to commit spiritual fraud. It was more than corruption. It was blasphemy disguised as paperwork. In every empire built on faith, there comes a moment when the symbols of salvation are turned into tools of suppression. Here, the decree was not merely a document. It was a mirror. And in its reflection, the Church saw not the face of Christ, but the machinery of fear. That night, Father Ricardo celebrated Christmas Mass in the same small chapel where months earlier he had prayed to be heard. The pews were filled again, survivors, families, journalists, and a few clergy who dared to stand with him. As the choir began to sing, Coronado lifted the chalice with trembling hands. He looked toward the crucifix, voice steady despite the weight of the months behind him. "Truth," he said softly, "cannot be excommunicated." The congregation fell silent. Outside, the bells of Lima rang, clear, defiant, and unafraid. And though the church's walls remained high, the sound carried beyond them, across oceans, into archives, into conscience, where no forged seal could silence it. Someone used the keys of Peter to lock out the truth. In Rome, the marble glowed white beneath the December sun. Tourists filed into St. Peter's Square, unaware that within the walls of the Apostolic Palace, the highest officials of the Catholic Church were contending with something far weightier than Christmas liturgies. They were contending with a ghost. Not the ghost of heresy or doctrinal dispute, but of truth uncontained, truth that refused to stay buried. The forged decree against Father Ricardo Coronado Arascu had been exposed. And now, the Vatican, the heart of the Church, could no longer remain still. On January 5, 2025, after days of pressure, media speculation, and internal unease, the Vatican press office released a carefully worded, cautious communiqué. The Holy See is aware of the reports surrounding an alleged decree pertaining to Reverend Ricardo Coronado Arascu. The dicastery for the clergy confirms that no such decree was issued or authorized by His Holiness Pope Leo XIV. A preliminary investigation has been opened to clarify the matter. There was no apology. No mention of the victims. No affirmation of Father Coronado's innocence, only the passive language of bureaucracy wrapped in diplomacy. The statement was meant to diffuse the scandal. Instead, it poured gasoline on the fire. Within hours, Catholic media across the world split into factions. Some publications, particularly those aligned with conservative bishops, defended the Pope, urging the faithful to trust the Holy Father's prudence and avoid speculation that could harm the unity of the Church. Others, led by theologians, journalists, and clergy calling for transparency, demanded a full canonical investigation, naming names, and calling the forgery not just a scandal, but sacrilege. This wasn't a clerical error, one commentator wrote. It was an attempt to excommunicate truth itself. Talk shows debated whether Pope Leo XIV had known about the document. Editorials asked, if he didn't know, why not? If he did, why was nothing done? Online, hashtags began trending in multiple languages. #Justice for Coronado. #Lute Case. #Truth in the Church. The questions multiplied. But inside the Vatican, answers were in short supply. In the days following the press release, a series of emergency meetings took place inside Vatican chambers known only to a few. Cardinals arrived silently through side entrances. Their robes were muted, their expressions unreadable. The meetings were not public. No statements were issued. But sources close to the Curia leaked fragments of what was said behind the closed doors. One cardinal, reportedly from Latin America, raised his voice. "This is not just about Peru. This is about Rome's silence and what it says to the world." Another, older, leaned forward and spoke gravely. "If we allow forged decrees to go unpunished, then every document signed by Peter's successor is suspect. We are not defending unity, we are dismantling it." But not all voices agreed. Some argued for damage control. Others questioned Coronado's motives. One even suggested the case be quietly resolved, invoking the need to protect the dignity of the papacy. The room was split, not by politics, but by conscience. In that chamber, two visions of the Church clashed. One loyal to the institution, the other loyal to the gospel. As the cardinals debated, Catholics around the world began to act. In Colombia, a group of seminarians held a silent vigil outside their cathedral, holding signs that read, "No más silencio." No more silence. In Poland, a priest preached from the pulpit, "We are not children who must be protected from the truth. We are the body of Christ, and the body bleeds when lies are clothed in vestments." In Ireland, survivors of abuse lit candles on the steps of churches where they had once been silenced. In Peru, the response was even more visceral. Dozens of parish groups organized processions in honor of Coronado. They carried images of Our Lady alongside banners that read, "Blessed are those who defend the voiceless." On the night of January 9th, in Lima's Plaza Mayor, hundreds gathered for a public prayer vigil. They prayed not for vengeance, but for truth. They sang hymns. They lit candles. They called out the names of the survivors. And beneath it all was a growing, thunderous question. Where is the Church's soul? In Chiclayo, where it had all begun, the victims waited. The parish of San Lorenzo remained quiet. Masses were smaller. Father Vasquez's name was no longer mentioned, but his shadow lingered. One of the survivors, now in his 20s, sat on the steps of the church and spoke to a journalist. "They say the Pope is a good man. That he didn't know. But I was a boy when this started. I'm a man now. And I still haven't heard him say our names." He paused. "Father Ricardo did. That's why they tried to erase him. But you can't excommunicate someone who loves the Church more than the ones who run it." As the uproar grew, Pope Leo XIV remained silent. He did not speak of Coronado during the Angelus. He did not mention the Lute Case in his general audience. He made no personal statement to the victims in Peru. To his defenders, this was seen as prudence. To others, it was a wound deepening with every passing day. Behind the silence, speculation grew. Was the Pope being shielded by advisors? Had he read Coronado's appeal? Did he know the truth and choose not to act? Inside the walls of the Vatican, only a handful knew the answers. But outside, the silence spoke louder than doctrine. Power may hide behind marble walls, but conscience has no walls at all. It moves in whispers, in prayers, in the quiet courage of those who kneel when others command them to look away. And when the Church forgets that its strength is not in secrecy but in sacrifice. then its altars become merely stages. And its robes, costumes. That evening, as the sun faded over Lima, a small parish chapel stood nearly empty. Inside, a boy, no more than 10, entered quietly. He wore a faded white robe. His sandals scraped softly on the stone floor. He walked past the pews, past the flickering candles, and stopped before a statue of Our Lady of Sorrows. Her eyes carved downward in eternal grief. At her feet, a dozen wax stubs glowed faintly. The boy took a small candle from his coat. He placed it in the holder. He struck a match, hesitated, then lit it. The flame flickered, catching the edges of the Virgin's robes in golden light. He looked up at her. Then he whispered, "For Father Ricardo." And in that simple act, unseen, unrecorded, uncelebrated, something holy happened. A prayer was offered. A witness was kept. And faith, fragile but undefeated, flickered back into life. The investigation remained open. No final report had been issued. No arrests made. No declaration from Rome offering closure. But even without verdicts, something had shifted, not only in Peru, not only in the Vatican, but in the hearts of the faithful. The scandal had exposed the fracture lines. The silence had confirmed them. And yet, amid the weight of betrayal, something sacred had survived. It came weeks later, during a Sunday Angelus broadcast from St. Peter's Square. Tens of thousands gathered below the Apostolic Palace, their faces turned upward, hopeful or wary, depending on what they still believed. Pope Leo XIV appeared at the window, dressed in white, his hands folded calmly against the breeze. His homily was brief, a reflection on the Gospel of Mark, where Christ speaks of the cost of discipleship. He said nothing of forged decrees. Nothing of Peru. Nothing of Father Ricardo Coronado. But near the end, his voice softened. There are moments in the life of the Church when we are called to face painful truths, not with fear, but with the courage of faith. Only by walking through the valley of shame can we be restored to the light of grace. He gave no names. He offered no elaboration. But across living rooms, parish halls, and cathedral pews, many heard what was not said, and recognized it as more than omission. Some called it an admission cloaked in diplomacy. Others said it was far too little, far too late. But for those who had been watching and waiting, for the survivors, for the forgotten, even that fleeting reference was a sign. The silence had cracked. On the first Sunday of Lent, under overcast skies and a lingering summer heat, the people of Chiclayo gathered for Mass at Parroquia San Lorenzo. It was the same church where it had all begun. The same pews. The same altar. The same bells. But the spirit in the room was different now. Not healed, but honest. Not triumphant, but true. The walls had absorbed decades of silence. Now, for the first time, they held voices. Families arrived quietly, many carrying candles, some carrying photos of sons and brothers who no longer attended Mass, or no longer lived. At the side of the altar stood an easel bearing a single image. A black and white photo of Father Ricardo Coronado, hands folded, eyes lifted. Beneath it, a small placard read, "Blessed are the peacemakers, even when they are not believed." The bishop of the diocese had not attended. But a young parish priest, newly ordained, stood in his place. And when he stepped to the pulpit, his first words were not from a sermon, but from a confession. Before we speak of God's mercy, we must first speak of our failure to protect those who needed it most. He paused, visibly shaken. Today, we begin again. Not with denial, but with repentance. The liturgy unfolded with reverence and stillness. During the prayers of the faithful, the names of the survivors were read aloud, every name that had ever appeared in the sealed files of the Lute Case. For each, a candle was lit. Then, after a long silence, the final name was spoken. We remember Father Ricardo Coronado Arascu, priest and advocate, whose voice called us to truth when truth was too painful to hear. The bells rang once. Not for tradition, but for memory. And in the pews, more than a few wept. Across the world, similar liturgies unfolded in quiet corners of the church. In Manila, a cardinal spoke openly of the Coronado scandal as a failure of conscience. In Krakow, seminarians held a public reading of the Gospel of Luke, the same passage Father Ricardo had quoted in his petition, "For nothing is hidden that will not be made manifest." In Bogotá, priests gathered in retreat not to plan doctrine, but to examine their hearts, their complicity, their silence, their callings. Everywhere, something was stirring. It was not reform. Not yet. But it was remembrance. And remembrance, in the Church, is always the beginning of renewal. The Church is not destroyed by scandal. It is destroyed when it forgets why truth matters. Doctrine can survive storms. Liturgy can endure centuries. But without conscience, without the willingness to name the wound, it ceases to be a body, and becomes only a building. In Lima, at a seminary long known for its cautious conservatism, a quiet revolution had begun. A new class of seminarians gathered one evening for prayer. Not in the grand chapel, but in a side room, beneath a crucifix carved from old wood, where the paint had worn thin from decades of hands reaching for hope. They prayed not for promotion, not for ecclesial authority, not for favor, but for purity. "Let us not inherit silence," one whispered. "Let us inherit the truth." Then they did something small, but radical. They passed around a copy of Father Coronado's final appeal to Rome, the one he had written beneath flickering candlelight, his voice stripped bare of anger and rich with sorrow. They read it aloud. And when they finished, they stood. And they knelt. At the same altar where others had once been silent. In Chiclayo, the sun was setting, painting the sky with the soft hues of violet and rose. Inside San Lorenzo, the last of the faithful lingered. A mother traced the outline of her son's name in the book of intentions. An old man lit one last candle. And the young priest stepped into the sanctuary, offering a final blessing before extinguishing the altar flame. At the very back of the church, a small boy, no older than 9, walked in quietly. He wore a simple white robe. His shoes were dusty from the street. And in his hand, he carried a single candle, the wax still warm from his grip. He walked up the aisle, past the worn pews and flickering votives. He stopped before the statue of the Virgin, the same statue the other boy had prayed before months ago. He looked up, eyes wide. Then down. He whispered, "For the ones who tell the truth." He lit the candle. The flame shimmered. And for a brief, eternal moment, it was enough. The victims' voices now echo louder than the bells. A new generation of priests kneel at the same altar, not for power, but for purity. And perhaps, in facing its wounds, the Church may finally remember its heart.